Hello and welcome back to Learn BOSH tutorial series. This is Jamil again. In this video we're gonna go through the output of the BOSH create-env command that we did in the last two videos, and we're gonna explain one line at a time the output and what does it represent. In my opinion, I think it's very important for a BOSH operator especially, and even for a BOSH release creator, to know exactly what's going on whenever we do BOSH create-env, just to get a general idea of what we are technically deploying, specifically BOSH. So let's get to it. Before maybe a quick recap, in the previous videos what we did is that we ran the BOSH create-env and we were successful in creating a BOSH Lite director, which we talked about, and we were able to connect to it, and it was successful. So if you remember, we ran this command, and it was BOSH create-env, and we went through, if you remember, we went also through the state.json file, what does it represent, and what are the ops file, etc. So whenever we ran it, let's go through the output and to see exactly what's really happening. So let's start by this line. So if you remember whenever we do the BOSH create-env and we talked about the operations files, the files that we pass with the -o notation, everything will be stitched together into one YAML file, and that will be the manifest that we're gonna use to deploy our BOSH director for the first time. So let's assume here that this is the manifest. It's bosh.yaml, and remember that by default it will be in memory, so you will not see actually the manifest itself that will be created. You can always do BOSH interpolate and then see the actual manifest, but if you just do BOSH create-env, you will not see the actual aggregated manifest. So the first thing it's gonna do, BOSH create-env, it's gonna stitch it together in memory, that file, and then it's gonna start to create the state.json file. At the beginning it's gonna be mostly empty because it will be filled with later details. So after it does that, it will start validating, and then you can see this whole section here, and then that validating, you can see that it's start to download something. So you can see here it starts to download the BOSH release, start to download the BOSH virtual CPI, downloading the BOSH version CPI, all that stuff, etc. Now one thing actually that stands out is downloading the BOSH release, downloading release BOSH. So what is that exactly? We talked previously about what is a BOSH release of something. So let's say it's a BOSH we have a BOSH release of Postgres. That means we package this Postgres bits together in a way that BOSH can understand and can deploy. But in reality, when we see something like download the release BOSH, what does it mean? It means we are downloading a BOSH release of BOSH itself. It sounds a bit weird, that's okay, but what it technically means is that we are packaging the BOSH software itself, just the bits and the software, let's say all the libraries needed to run the BOSH related processes. We are running it in a specific format, which is technically a release of BOSH, so that we can use it for certain things later. And that later thing is for the ability of the CLI itself to deploy the BOSH. So maybe if that sounds confusing, let's maybe split it into few steps. We know that if we want to deploy Postgres, we want to bring the BOSH release of Postgres and then give it to BOSH, and then BOSH will deploy our Postgres release into set number of VMs. When we say we want to create BOSH itself, there's technically no BOSH to create it, so we need something to create the BOSH VM and install the software on it. For that we need to have the CLI, and the CLI is actually the, let's say, the brain that's gonna do that. So the CLI will take the BOSH release, the BOSH of itself, so the bits and libraries needed. Let's imagine it's a tarball. It's gonna use that, and it's gonna somehow communicate, as we discussed before. The CLI will communicate through the CLI with the IaaS of choice, and then it's gonna create VM, and then it's gonna do something with that BOSH release, the bits that it's gonna have. So before it does all of that, which we're gonna discuss in the next step. It's gonna download it, and whenever we say it's gonna download it, it will be downloaded from BOSH.io website most probably, and you can see if you open the manifest.yaml file, this one, you will see the URL for where it's exactly downloading all those tarballs. So we're gonna skip through many of them, and we're gonna discuss maybe a bit about downloading stem cell. So all of those above are the actual releases that we're gonna use, but here it's a bit different. It says downloading stem cell, and the reason we're downloading a stem cell is because we're gonna use the stem cell as the base OS image that we're gonna create the BOSH VM from. So if you remember, BOSH VM is the VM that will have the BOSH software on it, and that VM, it's gonna be built itself from a stem cell, the same way that whenever BOSH creates a set of VMs, the base OS image will be a stem cell. BOSH itself, whenever we create the BOSH VM or the CLI creates it, it's gonna use a stem cell as well to create it. So that's why we download the stem cell here. So after we download all those artifacts, we can start to see, it says start installing CPI. And because this is BOSH Lite, as we have described before, it will use the VirtualBox CPI in this scenario. And because at this point here, and even at this point here, so even whenever we finish installing the CPI, there's no BOSH VM. It's only, we have just our machine that we are working on that's running the software. So in this, what does it mean by started installing CPI is that it's compiling the CPI that we need to create the BOSH VM through. It's compiling it locally on this machine. So in this scenario, it's a VirtualBox CPI, and it's built with Golang. So you can see that the Golang binary, it's here. So basically all the necessary bits to make the CPI ready to be used, it's gonna be ready at this point. So this is just to remember and to reiterate, it's making the VirtualBox CPI runnable on your machine, so only on your machine in this scenario. And this is the CLI doing that. There's no BOSH VM yet. So at this point, what do we have? We have the artifacts, and then we have the local VirtualBox CPI ready to be used. You can see here at this point it says starting registry. I'm gonna skip it. It's an internal BOSH mechanism to do specific things, and potentially it's gonna be removed, so I don't think it's worth to talk about it for now. So it's easily we can skip it. And then you can see here starting upload the stem cell. So what does that mean, starting upload the stem cell? This means that we are giving the stem cell that we have downloaded here, we are giving it to the IS so that it can be used to create the VM from. In this scenario, let's imagine that we are giving the stem cell that we have downloaded here, we are giving it to the VirtualBox, so that whenever we tell VirtualBox, please create me a VM, which is the BOSH VM, it will use that stem cell. So imagine that uploading of stem cell is giving it to your IaaS of choice, and the CLI will do it through the CPI that we have just compiled here. So till now, everything is local. Up until here, we are just executing the command. Everything is local, except whenever we are uploading the stem cell, we are giving it to the IaaS of choice. After we give the IaaS of choice our stem cell, and the CLI does that through the CPI, we're going to start the act of creating the VM, which is the BOSH VM. So you can see here this line, it says creating VM, for instance, whatever, BOSH 0, from this stem cell. It's going to communicate. So what's going to happen here is that the CLI is going to communicate with the CPI locally, the VirtualBox, and it's going to communicate with the IaaS to create a VM of specific configuration, type, and size, whatever we have specified, and it's going to create it from this OS image, which is our stem cell. And then after it issues this command, the CLI will wait for an agent that is on that VM, the BOSH VM that we have created, to come up. So remember that we created the BOSH VM from a stem cell, and every stem cell includes an agent. So what's going to happen is that the CLI is going to wait for the agent to come up so that it knows that the VM is ready. So how this communication is gonna happen is gonna be over HTTPS. So the CLI will communicate directly with the agent, and then it's gonna ask like, "Hey agent, are you ready? Are you ready? Are you alive yet?" And technically, the agent will have an HTTP server that the CLI will communicate to. Whenever the agent come up, that means that the VM has come up too. So the CLI will continue to do extra steps. And in this scenario, it's gonna start to create a disk. What does that mean is it's gonna issue a command to the IaaS to create a disk, which is in this scenario, it's gonna be a persistent disk, and it will issue also a command after it create the disk to attach this disk to the VM that we have created. Which is the BOSH VM. So we create a disk, the persistent disk, and then we're gonna issue also a command for the IaaS, in this scenario the VirtualBox, to attach this disk to the VM. And this disk will be used for persistent storage, so that later on, if we want to update the director, it will be used. So at this point, what do we have? To recap, we have a VM that has been created, the agent is running on it, it's alive. We have created a disk and attached that persistent disk to the running VM, which is the BOSH. So in this scenario, after this, what's going to happen is, for just the purpose of this video, let's imagine that the BOSH release that we have downloaded here, and any other, let's say, releases that we care about, we're going to transfer that to the actual BOSH VM, and then we're going to compile those packages, we're going to compile them on the BOSH VM. So at this point where we are highlighting this, the BOSH VM, let's say it has the agent, and let's say it has no processes related to BOSH except the agent running. Let's imagine that. What we're going to do is we're going to send those bits of the releases, including the BOSH release, which contain the BOSH software. We're going to send it to the VM. We're going to compile it, and the agent has a role in that, so the CLI will send commands to the agent so that it knows how to compile things and know exactly what's happening. And you can see here it says compiling package, Ruby, all that stuff, etc., MySQL. Those are coming from the releases that we have provided here. So those releases will be uploaded, and then they will be compiled on the BOSH VM. And it's worth to mention here that all these packages, as you have seen, it says skip package already compiled, almost all of them except I think one. That means that we are using pre-compiled releases that will make things much faster. So what happened is, at this point, whenever it finished compiling all the releases, it will say I'm starting to update the BOSH 0 instance. What does that mean is, after compiling all the bits of the software needed to run BOSH, now we're ready to run BOSH, to run the BOSH processes. This is also going to happen through the communication of the CLI with the agent. And what will happen is the agent will start the agent on the BOSH stem cell, on the BOSH VM. At this point, it's gonna start those processes through the commands from the CLI. After those processes are starting, you can see here it says waiting for BOSH 0 to be running. That means that our CLI is waiting for the BOSH processes to be running that are on the BOSH VM, and then it will run, let's say, post start scripts. This is, let's skip it for now, it's a stage of deploying specific things in BOSH, but this is like a hook that is gonna run after deploying. So at this point, what do we have is we have the BOSH software running, and if we remember, it's the director, it's running on the BOSH VM plus other processes, including the health monitor, plus many things which we hopefully will cover later on. So at this point we have everything running, and we can start to communicate directly with the director process running on the VM. So now at this point there's no need anymore to communicate with the agent that is running on the BOSH VM, because think about the agent that is running on the BOSH VM is used when we bootstrap the BOSH VM, and we're gonna forget about it until we wanna probably upgrade our BOSH director. That's where the agent comes into place. So after all that is running, the agent on the BOSH VM is aside. We don't need it anymore, and we can directly start talking with the BOSH director, which is one of these processes that were started. This communication will be through the BOSH CLI, directly talking to the director over HTTPS without going through agent or any kind of loops or proxies. So it's going to be the CLI directly going to the BOSH director. This is the exact, more or less the exact scenario that's going to be run whenever you do BOSH create-env. Hopefully that explains things, and later in the next video, or hopefully in the next few videos, we're going to jump SSH into the BOSH VM, and we're going to inspect what are these processes that we have installed here. So hopefully it's easier to understand more of what's going on. This is it's not in-depth knowledge what's going on, but it's good to understand what BOSH create-env does, so that if anything went wrong, we can fix it. Plus, it's general knowledge, good to have it anyways. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next videos.